Hey you, listen here, okay?
Who's got 2 thumbs and loves retro video games?
Go on.
Who's got a degree in media production and is insecure enough to try and flaunt it online?
Are you coming on to me?
Who loves Dragon Ball, can't play sports, and is really, really lonely.
Despite my best efforts, I just couldn't get anyone to play through this one with me.
His name's Niche, he plays games, and he's about to review a staple for the Toonami generation.
Wait, me?
So, grab a Capri Sun and kick back, because it's time for some early 2000s nostalgia on the latest Does It Hold Up? Only on Toonami.
Hey guys, so I was out and about when I stumbled across an epic battle between good and evil, decided to stick around to see who won, and... You, man, you've got a literal gun! Okay, but in my defense, the evil King Piccolo killed all of my friends who happened to be the strongest martial artists in the world. Like, in my situation, a peace is warranted. You just look like the ending to Freaks and Geeks. Well, if I'm being honest, I've been standing here for the past 7 hours and they still haven't started. Yeah, something's telling me we'll be here for a while. Released in 2003, Dragon Ball Z: The Legacy of Goku II is a top-down RPG for the Game Boy Advance. Developed by Webfoot Technologies and published by Atari, the game follows the events of the future Trunks, Android, and Cell arcs from Akira Toriyama's legendary Dragon Ball manga. As the title implies, the game serves as the sequel to the first Legacy of Goku from the previous year and fleshes out the relatively bare bones and unpolished gameplay found in it in a myriad of ways. The game is also unique amongst Dragon Ball Z games, not just of the era, but in general by being the first, and as far as I can tell, only Dragon Ball Z game to be developed in the West and get released in Japan. Due to the game being a Western production, it's also unique from other Dragon Ball titles in the sense that it directly lifts some of its script and music from the then still in production Funimation dub that was airing on Toonami at the time and was literally introducing a generation of kids to anime in the process. At the time of its release, the Legacy of Goku II received fairly decent scores from critics across the board, who all more or less said that the game reflected a level of quality and polish that the first game should have had to begin with. I think that IGN really encapsulated the general sentiment when it came to positive reviews of the game when they said that, quote, "The adventure design in Legacy of Goku II, a far better game than last year's offering, has enough going for it that it can actually grab non-fans into its storyline, possibly convincing players unfamiliar with the Trunks, Android, and Cell sagas to watch all 38 hours of the anime to get the full experience." So it'll probably come as no surprise to anyone who's watched this channel for a minute, but I'm something of a Dragon Ball fan. And I owe a lot of that not just to watching the anime as a kid, but to playing many of the Dragon Ball Z games that came out back in the early 2000s and included the Legacy of Goku II. And as such, it's perhaps a little unsurprising that I consider it one of my favorite games of all time, as well as one that I only somewhat hyperbolically believe could be one of the greatest sequels of all time. And that's not necessarily because of its quality or anything either, but because of what it represents to me, and seeing as this game kept getting requested to me on my Legacy of Goku I review, what I can only assume it represents to an entire generation of people that are at least in their mid-20s and grew up with it. More than that, I genuinely consider this to be the game that helped get me into JRPGs. Because while I did play stuff like Final Fantasy and Pokemon as a kid, the Legacy of Goku II was the first time that the genre really clicked for me. To the point of me considering this to be a bit like Squaresoft's Secret of Mana for kids from the early 2000s such as myself, an idea that I'll be getting into later in this video. But does it hold up? Because while nostalgia for something and its impact on you is cool and all, heck, it was literally the premise of the second half of my last video, that doesn't necessarily make a game great. And while the Legacy of Goku II did get decent reviews back in the day, a lot of them seemed to fixate on the fact that the game was a follow-up to a title that was just barely functional by comparison. Plus, to truly hold up close to 20 years after its original release, the Legacy of Goku II will need to justify its existence when compared to other, newer adaptations of Dragon Ball's story that feature better graphics, more complex gameplay, and an even bigger chunk of the Dragon Ball story. Stories that, by the way, are technically more accurate to the source material due to being an adaptation of the original Japanese script as opposed to the somewhat Americanized Funimation one from back in the day. And while that may seem like a relatively minor difference, it's probably at least a bit bigger than it seems from the outset, since it reflects the fact that this game represents a version of Dragon Ball Z that's no longer fully reflective of the series' tone in the West. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What's a game that got you into one of your favorite genres? Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. And if you're new here and are enjoying what you see so far, feel free to subscribe to the channel so that you can check out all the other fun stuff I'll be putting out in the future. You could also check out my Patreon or donate to my Buy Me a Coffee in order to show your support, or check out my retro movie and TV podcast on your favorite podcast player. Links to all of those are in the description. And with that out of the way, on with the video. In order to do this game justice, I thought it'd be for the best to briefly summarize my Legacy of Goku I video so that even newcomers to the channel can go into things with the appropriate context, since as a sequel that I also called one of the best ones of all time, a bit of this review will naturally be rooted in comparison. The original Legacy of Goku isn't good. It's not unplayable, but it's not good. It's a slow, buggy game that races from plot point to plot point without so much as a moment to spare, and only barely qualifies as being alright, in large part due to its short length for an action RPG and a few decent songs in its soundtrack. If there was ever a Dragon Ball game from the era to come out, fail, then fade into obscurity while Dragon Ball fans moved on to the next handful of licensed games that probably came out the same day as it, the first Legacy of Goku almost definitely wins that award, along with Dragon Ball Z Taiketsu and Ultimate Tenkaichi for good measure. And yet, it didn't fade into obscurity. In fact, as you could tell since you're watching this video, it actually managed to get 2 sequels, and I can only assume that it did because this game may have already been in production when the first one came out. At any rate, the Legacy of Goku II is here to stay, and it's a major improvement over its predecessor. Due to taking place almost entirely on Earth this time around, the game feels like it has a single cohesive world to explore, and even though this game is about Goku's legacy, more on that later, we now have access to 5, technically 6, characters that we get to guide through the story. Unlike many of the other Dragon Ball Z games from the era, or even to this day to some extent, the game features solid action RPG gameplay where you're expected to travel from area to area to trigger cutscenes, fight baddies, and train to level up and get stronger so that you can continue to progress through the narrative. It's also different from many of its contemporaries in the sense that it features an open world populated with characters to talk to, secrets to uncover, and much to the game's credit, manages to do so in a relatively clear-cut and somewhat linear way thanks to the easy-to-understand level layouts, a map to help you navigate those areas, and waypoints on the world map to show you where the next story beat is located. Anyway, the opening up of the world and giving the player the opportunity to explore it seriously elevates this game over its predecessor. Because while the Legacy of Goku II offers more than a simple world to explore, the fact that it does allow you to do so is important in the sense that it realizes the most important thing that the first game needed to do and failed at. It actually allows you to feel like you're a part of the world of Dragon Ball. Even though the first game did allow you to explore the world at times, the strict adherence to a barely hidden level structure made these interactions feel extremely hollow. But in the Legacy of Goku II, you can revisit areas that you've been to before and chat with characters you've already spoken to in order to hear their thoughts on the plot's progression. Heck, depending on what character you play as, you can even get different responses from the same characters. This is great because it accomplishes the goal of making the place feel alive in a way that the original just didn't. You know that episode of Rick and Morty that takes place in a simulation? Well, the Legacy of Goku I is that simulation when it's running on fumes.
I'm going to make love to my wife!
Looking good.
Slow down, my man!
While that change probably appears quite rustic by today's standards, it's huge in its impact here and may be my favorite change between the two games. Even though you can technically construe the inclusion of traveling from one part of the map to another as filler, it never really feels like it is. If anything, it actually does wonders for the game's pacing by allowing us to actually get some breathing room between story beats. Although it is also a bit annoying when you sit through a cutscene and then have to travel to another area in order to effectively continue that cutscene. That said, the pacing's something that I'll need to get into later though, as I think I've gone long enough without talking about this game's other big improvement, which is the combat.
Combat.
Right off the bat, the game's combat is simple, but delightful in its execution. There's no denying that the action in this game is a bit bare bones, but it nails the fundamentals and manages to throw just enough of Dragon Ball Z's charm into the mix to make it interesting. Aside from the expected punches and generic energy blasts, you also have access to character-specific special attacks, a special melee technique that can be used to do extra damage to enemies, and transformations for each character that burns through your available ki in order to give you a notable increase in your speed and strength. And while these are all great additions in and of themselves, the real improvement to the game's combat comes from the inclusion of tiny details like knockback and a damage counter. The best way that I could put it is that they go a long way in telegraphing the strength of you and your enemy's attacks and in how much your characters grow during your playthrough. I know these sound like small details to be talking about at such lengths, but the inclusion of them in this game is a huge improvement over what was found in the original game. Put simply, seeing numbers appear whenever you hit an enemy and watching that number increase as you gain levels during the game is an enduring trope within RPGs for a reason. It's a positive feedback loop that has its roots in table-based role-playing games and has the same dopamine release that something like getting likes and comments on social media posts does. And psychologically speaking, it also reminds me quite a bit of how idle games work. In the FictionTalk.com article, The Psychology of Idle Games, Why Humans Like Big Numbers, Dr. Yamaya Hallbrook cites B.F. Skinner's famous Skinner box experiment where he developed the concept of operant conditioning, which, for the purposes of this explanation, can be simplified as being the idea of positive reinforcement and rewarding players for certain actions that we'd like to see them continue to do. It's a pretty interesting article that I highly recommend to anyone curious about the mechanism of the genre and basically points to the satisfaction we feel in seeing larger numbers start to appear in these idle games as a form of an achievement, even when the numbers mean little to nothing in the grand scheme of things. And that got me thinking about how the idea could apply to other games like the Legacy of Goku II. Seeing the amount of damage you do is a reward because it shows you that you're hurting enemies and that you're becoming a more effective fighter as the game progresses. Even better, it communicates this to you implicitly and doesn't require that you pause the game to physically see what level you are or what your stats now are. Basically, it takes the statistical underpinnings of your characters and turns it into something intuitive. On top of that, even though seeing those numbers is a good enough reward in and of itself, it also has the added bonus of giving you a bit of a power trip by making the rest of the game easier in the process. Something that, by the way, is intrinsically compatible with Dragon Ball.
How did you acquire this new strength?
I do a lot of push-ups and sit-ups, and I drink plenty of juice.
So, it's a twofer. A Legacy of Goku twofer. Get it? Haha. Albeit one that doesn't bring into account all the ways that operant conditioning can actually be used to exploit the player into continuing to play a game that they may not enjoy. But it's still a Legacy of Goku twofer. And looking at the knockback experienced whenever you hit someone or you get hit yourself, it serves the purpose of adding dynamics to the action that was sorely lacking in the first game. It keeps you on your toes as you now have to manage juggling opponents as you fight them, making sure that you aren't bunching multiple enemies together so that you don't get juggled yourself, and it also makes the action look more involved. Also new to this game are pickups within many of the battlefields. While you could pause the game at any time in the first Legacy of Goku in order to use items to heal, you can now also rely on food and key pickups that don't require pausing the game and keeps the action moving at a brisk pace. And speaking of a brisk pace, you can now sprint, by the way, and also move much faster than you did in the original game to begin with, though you also can't fly wherever you want to anymore. It ain't all perfect though.
Why did you get this nice camp? It's clever, just like you.
The enemy's AI is dumb as nails, and while certainly less buggy than its forebearer, battles can still get cheesed if you happen to be playing as the right character and make creative use of your surroundings. In fact, I actually remember using a rock to do that exact thing near the top of the stage during my final fight with Cell as a kid due to being a bit too underleveled for the battle. Another complaint I have with the combat though is how meaningless each of the characters' stats can feel as the game goes on. Basically, in spite of the fact that each character has different special attacks and a chargeable melee technique, these characters just all end up feeling way too samey for their own good. Whether you're playing as Goku, Gohan, Trunks, the Pickle Monster,
And the Prince of all Scions!
it never feels like you need to change your approach to the game in order to better accommodate their individual skill sets, and it just would have been cool to see Webfoot Technologies try their hand at differentiating the characters in ways that other RPGs handled their rosters. For example, maybe they could have made Gohan a bit more of a glass cannon, using the combination of low stamina and health coupled with high damage outputs as a reflection of his relative inexperience with and unwillingness to fight despite his great potential. And maybe we could have had a Trunks that used his sword outside of his charged melee attack, which would have allowed us to fight more enemies from afar at the cost of lower damage output or something. Goku could have been our everyman, which reflects his importance as the quote-unquote ideal fighter of the bunch. Vegeta could have been our tank, and Piccolo could have been our wacky fun character who uses his Gumby arms and can recover health faster than the others as a representation of his Namekian heritage and status as the only playable non-Saiyan. And the game could have also kept Trunks and Vegeta's bulky and slow Super Saiyan permutations from the later part of the game around for longer too as alternate transformations to help differentiate things further. As is though, the only real thing you can do to help differentiate the characters from each other is use capsules you find on your adventure to permanently boost some stats, or to make sure that you use their special attacks, something that isn't bad in and of itself, but kinda goes against the game's sandbox nature of being set in an open world. Additionally, I can't help but feel like a bit too many of the boss battles or story confrontations in this game came down to simple fisticuffs in a small and enclosed area. Even though I do get why that's the case, I mean it's a 4th generation adaptation of a shonen battle manga after all, it just feels like a major missed opportunity to have not thrown in some mini games or chases into the mix for a bit more variety. And it's not like the game doesn't do this in the form of fetch quests or filler sections, but it's just that the game very clearly makes a distinction between the filler that changes the gameplay up and actual plot progression, which is always rooted in arena-style combat. What I'm saying is that it would have been pretty cool to get different gameplay styles in this game, like maybe a level where you're chasing Android 20 around in an auto runner section and you have to fire key blasts at him and dodge obstacles, or a section where you play as Android 18 and have to hide from Semi-Perfect Cell as he hunts her down. And yeah, you may have had to tweak a couple of things as far as the chronology of Dragon Ball goes, but 1, the game already does that a bit, and 2, what's the point of adapting something to a new medium if you aren't actually taking advantage of that medium's inherent strengths? Flipping back to the positive though, the game manages to be really well paced in spite of that. And by that, I mean that the game actually has pacing now, unlike its predecessor. The storytelling has peaks and valleys, and the game moves at a much more coherent cadence due to having extra characters for you to take control of whenever one of them bows out of the story, which was a huge problem in the original Legacy of Goku. In that game, you were beholden to Goku. He was the only playable character, and because of it, we followed the story in his footsteps, often to the detriment of the storytelling. Basically, if Goku wasn't there when it happened, it wasn't shown within the game itself, leading to major plot points from the manga and anime literally getting thrown to the side, and as you can expect, it makes for a very confusing and unrefined retelling of the first third of Dragon Ball Z. But thankfully, that doesn't happen here. Even though parts of this game's story can sometimes feel like it's moving faster than it needs to, there's still a complete story being told here, and it's still getting told with just enough dramatic heft to have newcomers to the franchise at least understand how they're supposed to feel. By comparison, going into the first Legacy of Goku without any knowledge of Dragon Ball feels more like trying to watch Avengers Endgame without ever having seen a Marvel movie. Additionally, this version of the Dragon Ball Z story being told here is interesting in the sense that it's reflective of a script that has since been scratched from canon. Seeing as current Dragon Ball projects like the Dragon Ball Super anime and movies basically just defer to the manga or Kai for references, the elongated story found in the original Dragon Ball Z anime exists in its own limbo these days. And to add to that, the game doesn't just represent that version of the show, but rather the American dub of that show specifically, which in itself introduced a few changes to the script and tone before getting adapted again by the developers for this game. I'd even go as far as to call this a fairly fairly adequate take on retelling one of Dragon Ball's most iconic arcs. Honestly, its biggest sin is that it's the result of several rounds of adaptation telephone, and as such, truncates and remixes things in an attempt to streamline the story as much as possible, while still trying to also feel cohesive and like it was a labor of love on the part of the developers.
We do extensive research on the series. We're already fans and familiar with it, but it's important for us to go back through and watch the episodes that are going to be relevant to the game and pick out what parts we want to represent in the game. We obviously can't cover everything because the game would be 200 hours long, but we pick out what we think is the most important and we go with that.
Though I do have to call out whoever designed the game's PAL box art though, because yikes, the number of images from after this arc in it is tantamount to false advertising. And I may be a little biased in saying this, as this game and Budokai 1 were actually my introduction to this part of Dragon Ball's story as far as I can tell, but I actually think that it does a fairly good job of telling this part of the story. You know, like, all things considered. Although this game does introduce one plot thread in the opening act of the game with a glaring plot hole in it. Pretty early on in your adventure, you're confronted by the evil Lord Frieza's brother Cooler, who's a non-canon character that was introduced in one of the Dragon Ball Z movies. When he shows up in the game, he basically says that he's out for revenge for what happened to his brother, who literally had just died within the context of the game itself, and that instead of fighting you here and now, he'll be waiting for you on the planet New Namek, which you can visit after completing one of the game's side quests.
야무치님, 좋은 먹이가 오고 있습니다.
뭐라고?
야무치님 같이 가요!
And even though that's nothing like how it happened in his two movies, and if anything is a very forced amalgamation of those stories, it's kinda hilarious because of how long it's implied he was waiting for you there. You see, a few minutes later in the game, there's a 3-year time skip that happened in the anime while the characters trained to fight the androids, and, well, yeah, let's just say that by the time you can even get to New Namek in the game, Cooler has spent the past few years standing around doing absolutely nothing. But despite that one plot hole, this is actually paced and told pretty well and manages to capture some of the melodrama from the manga and anime. Even the little details like adding an ellipsis to the dialogue boxes whenever a character takes a beat goes a long way in simulating the long drawn out pauses that are all over the anime. Speaking of which, let's check up on that epic battle between good and evil, shall we? Hey, are you guys kicking the crap out of each other yet? Oh, this gun's like actually falling apart. Okay. Well, I guess they're stalling for time this week. Maybe their manga's on hiatus or something. Who really knows? Burnout sucks, so we'll check up on them later. One thing that I couldn't help but notice with this game was that it changed saving from an action you could do anywhere in the game via the pause menu to one that could only be done at designated areas. And after taking some time to think about the repercussions of that change, I came to the conclusion that it actually helps strengthen the game's structure. In a weird way, placing a save point at the entrance to a new area or before a boss encounter or story beat imbues the game with a strong episodic structure that isn't that different from what you'd expect in the anime or manga. It's actually perfect for something made for the Game Boy Advance too, as it feeds into the portability of the console and how the best games on it are designed for shorter sessions. And coupled with the source material's episodic and serialized nature, it totally works as a means to separate and punctuate the game's various story beats, because I genuinely believe that Dragon Ball is best digested as a marathon as opposed to a sprint. It's also just like a nice reminder to save your game often, because speaking from experience, it's totally possible to get super far into Legacy of Goku 1 without saving, die, and then... Oh my god! He's shooting energy blasts out of his hand! What's he doing? He's holding a baby! That's his baby! He's still killing people with energy blasts! I do think that the game has a bit of a problem when it comes to its filler though. Like I mentioned a bit ago, the Legacy of Goku II tends to default to fetch quests whenever it needs to pad things out a bit, and they really stick out like a sore thumb. Regardless of how easy these sections are, the last thing I want to do when I'm playing a Dragon Ball Z game is do a trade quest to get a sandwich, or complete a puzzle to kill a loud partier's power.
Shut the hell up.
What's going on? Who turned off the lights?
And yeah, I don't exactly want more combat thrown my way here either, but I can't help but feel like there's a healthy medium to be found here. Like, in the case of that partying mission I just mentioned, why couldn't we just destroy his speakers or something? It would have been kind of fun to trash the guy's house as Vegeta while he ran around pleading with us to stop. Or instead of omitting some parts of the story, like the events that happen within the hyperbolic time chamber, we could get a filler stage that takes place within it and allows us to not only better understand the story, but to flesh out the characters a bit. Heck, the game goes out of its way to mention the filler-only Garlic Jr. arc, so why not just adapt that in as something that happened during the Android saga as opposed to before it? I generally consider this to be a minor gripe though, since the game's pacing isn't really hurt by it, but it does feel like the bare minimum was done in regards to those sections to pad the game for time. And in the case of us never seeing the interior of the hyperbolic time chamber, that feels like it was probably done in order to cut back on creating assets that would only realistically get used in that room.
Though, admittedly, the joke's also on them a bit there because they ended up having to do exactly that a year or so later for Boo's Fury.
Even the amount of grinding in this game feels pretty well paced, all things considered. There are definitely still moments where the game will slow down to a crawl and force you to lay waste to hordes of enemies in order to reach a prerequisite level needed to open the door and advance to the next story beat, but these moments are generally pretty painless. Plus, if you know what you're doing and don't mind cheesing the game a little bit, you can make pretty quick work of these sections anyway. For example, and by far the most egregious one in this game for that matter, in order to unlock the game's secret sixth character, who we're gonna get to in just a moment, you'll need to cap out every other character aside from Goku at level 50, which unlocks a statue of them at Capsule Corp. The only thing though is that this could prove to be a bit tiresome since a decent chunk of your characters will probably be in their mid-30s by the end of the game unless you took the time to train them in between missions, which if you want to crunch the numbers means that they're only about 60 to 70% of the way there. However, like I just said moments ago, you could always just cheese the game by finding an area that has a ton of decently strong enemies near the entrance to a room, giving them hell, then walking away and re-entering the room to force them to respawn so that you can repeat the cycle till you're finished. Anyway, once you've done that and finished the Cell games, you're rewarded with a secret character of Hercule, or as he's known outside of the Funimation dub, Mr. Satan.
So, did they know what's going on with his name, or...
Hail Satan! Hail Satan! Hail Satan!
Depending on whether or not Goku was at least level 45 when you beat the game, you'll either be getting a level 40 or a level 1 Mr. Satan, who you'll then need to grind through the game with to level 50 in order to get a bonus epilogue cutscene, and boy oh boy, I hope you're okay with exploiting the combat to get there because Mr. Satan is true to his character in the sense that he absolutely blows.
Yep. Satan sucks.
He has next to no health, can barely damage enemies, and has a single special attack that freezes enemies in their place for a couple of seconds at a time. And yet, he's a blast to play as. Despite the fact that combat with him is actively horrible and even grindier than it is with the other characters, I absolutely love having him around to play as due to the simple fact that he is the ultimate punchline for the game. For those unfamiliar with Dragon Ball Z, and spoiler alert if you care, the arcs covered in this game culminate in the series' main protagonist, Son Goku, sacrificing his life in an attempt to stop the evil android Cell from destroying the world and leaving his son Gohan to finish the job after he fails. It's a powerful and poignant moment where the meek and mild-mannered Gohan matures and takes on the mantle of being Earth's strongest protector, and it was originally intended as the high point that the series was poised to end on, but ultimately didn't. Despite that though, it's an extremely iconic moment in Dragon Ball, and the themes propelling it truly makes this game's title as the Legacy of Goku II a fitting one. Because if the high point of the first game was Goku becoming a Super Saiyan, a feat of strength only theorized about in legend up to that point, Goku's legacy in this game is Gohan.
I used to think life was all about me. I was the hero of my own story. I was Bruce Wayne of one lifelong issue of Detective Comics, so to speak. And that kid came along and suddenly you realize you're not Bruce Wayne anymore. You're Thomas Wayne.
It's why he's the first character we play as outside of the prologue, why the first character we're introduced to is his heroic future self before he's gunned down by androids, and why his character is the one with the clearest arc both in the game and its source material at this point in the story. Except that Gohan isn't heralded as the world's savior after defeating Cell, because, well, Mr. Satan ended up stealing Gohan's credit for it. And like, do I really need to explain why Mr. Satan being the reward for all of Gohan and company's hard work in this game is so funny? It flies in the face of everything that the game had been building towards, and it's a hilarious subversion of our expectations of a post-game bonus. Instead of maybe re-unlocking Goku as a playable character, getting to fight another secret boss from this era in the Dragon Ball Z movies like a pre-canon Broly or Bojack, or even just unlocking Super Saiyan 2 for use outside of Gohan's fight with Cell, we get frickin' Hercule. Everything about this character is an absolute gag, to the point where talking to each of the Z fighters or their friends while you play as him leads to them calling you names for claiming to have defeated Cell.
And as for the cutscene you unlock after maxing his level, it's just Hercule going on a talk show and bragging about how he beat Cell. And okay, like super random tangent incoming, but I actually think the area that this cutscene takes place in is inspired by Conan O'Brien's set from the 90s. And like, no, I'm not joking. Conan's old set had this like checkerboard design in the background where the guest would sit, and Hercule has the exact same pattern behind him in the TV studio.
Moving on though, something I was really excited to talk about in this video was how much mileage the game gets out of the Game Boy Advance's hardware. Visually, the game makes pretty good use of layering effects in the form of rain, fog, and leaves throughout many of the game's areas. And in terms of its music, it does an incredible job of recreating Bruce Falconer's Funimation score, as well as remixing and extending it as needed in order to make it suit an entire game.
Giannis and I both would listen to the music from the show extensively, and actually write it down note for note, and go from there. I mean, a lot of the cues on the show are maybe only like 30 seconds, so we have to turn that 30 seconds into, a 6-minute song.
Even during regular moments of gameplay, it's not all too hard to find yourself getting lost in how wonderfully evocative and wistful the world feels. While nostalgia may have factored into things somewhat for me, there was this moment early in the game when I was walking around the woods surrounding Goku's home, and the combination of sound and vision was genuinely so emotionally resonant with me that I just had to stop and appreciate things for a bit. And during more story-sensitive moments, it actually adds quite a bit of mise-en-scène to the game. I won't pretend this stuff is cinematic excellence or anything, but these games' cutscenes are a huge improvement over the first ones, and the music goes a long way in helping sell the emotions behind these moments. Plus, I also found myself enjoying a lot of this game's original music too, for that matter. Some of it kinda does skew a bit towards the generic at times, but for the most part, it's all pretty fun and catchy. Heck, some of it goes so far out of its way to sound like the Funimation score and does such a good job of it to the point where it gets kinda hard to tell the originals from the sound-alike stuff. Despite the fact that I largely prefer Dragon Ball Z's Japanese soundtrack over the original American one, there's no denying that the Legacy of Goku II's OST fits the game really well. And I think this is because, unlike the implementation in the Funimation dub, the game's soundtrack was actually arranged alongside the story this time. Even though some of it was originally from the show, the fact that it had to get rearranged during its production, coupled with the fact that it's no longer beholden to the very specific pacing of the English dub, which itself was beholden to the pace of the original Japanese release, means that it actually has more breathing room. Plus, even though the Game Boy Advance has a bit of a reputation for having rather limited sound capabilities, it's actually perfectly suited for Falconer's heavily synthesized and often ambient or noise sensibilities.
Oh, and the song for Mount Paozu/Goku's home is also seemingly inspired by Angelo Badalamenti's Twin Peaks theme. And I'm not saying that because I'm a Twin Peaks nerd, although that does factor into it a little bit. Like, no, they're actually similar. Take a listen.
Going back to the visuals though, it ain't all sunshine and rainbows. For starters, some of the sprites, specifically environmental objects like trees and stuff, can sometimes look outright ugly when playing on anything larger than a Game Boy Advance screen, due to trying to feature way too many colors for their own good without a smooth enough gradient or dithering to blend things together. There's also a decent number of reused visual assets from the first game, which is fine and fairly understandable, but can sometimes feel a bit lacking in cohesion when compared to the newer stuff. And last, the game's character portraits range from fine and, in a few cases, even pretty good, all the way down to not. In fact, some of them were so bad that later releases of the game even had to have a few of the portraits redone entirely. Still, these visual hiccups are minor, and when you add the entirety of the game's positives together, I think that you get a bit of a gem. Critics may have been a bit lukewarm on the game overall when it first came out, but when you put it next to the first Legacy of Goku game, it's hard for me not to look at this and think that this may be the greatest sequel of all time. Because while there are definitely better games that happen to be sequels to an already popular and beloved first entry, you know, stuff like Sonic 2, Halo 2, Call of Duty 2, the list goes on, the Legacy of Goku 2 feels unique in how it took a fairly mediocre title and managed to polish it as much as it did. The only other game that comes to mind off the top of my head that accomplishes a similar feat is Street Fighter 2, and how it was leaps and bounds better than the first one, which, let's be honest, is not that good of a game. And thinking about that change in quality from the first to second game made me realize that the Legacy of Goku 2's impact on myself was at least a little similar to the impact that a game like Secret of Mana had on an entire generation of gamers. Alright, so for the uninitiated when it comes to Secret of Mana, congrats! You're about to get knighted into the club of knowing about one of the internet's favorite SNES games. I won't go too into detail about this game as it isn't the focus of this video and because I'd genuinely like to cover it in much more detail someday, but Secret of Mana has long been considered one of the best and most popular action or JRPGs of all time. It's a title that many gamers in the 90s think fondly of for its memorable soundtrack, its fun and accessible action, and for being a relatively easy to understand introduction to role-playing games, a genre that was to some extent a bit niche amongst those with home consoles at the time. And similarly, many of the things that have been said about this game over the years can also apply to the Legacy of Goku II, although in a more microcosmic way. Because while RPGs were definitely more commonplace by 2003, thanks to the likes of Final Fantasy VII and Pokemon Fever back in the late 90s, this game was almost certainly the first action RPG that a generation of kids hooked on Toonami's airing of Dragon Ball Z got to experience. And even in the case of those rambunctious little rugrats that had played a JRPG before getting to this game, there's still a good chance that this game signified the first time that the genre fully clicked for them. I say that because the Legacy of Goku II wasn't my first RPG. By the time I got this game, I had already played stuff like Final Fantasy IX a bit, Pokemon Gens 1 and 2, Phantasy Star 2 on an old emulator on my PC, and yeah, I mean, while I did understand how to play those games at least a little bit, it wasn't until I actually sat down with this game that many of the tropes within the genre started to make sense for me. Even though this game's retelling of this chapter in Dragon Ball Z's story can sometimes be a little simple and truncated, I feel like it may have actually worked in favor of appealing to kids, because while RPGs are a great genre to feature nuanced and deep storytelling within video games, a lot of that may have gone over the heads of the children playing this game or straight up been too much text for them to want to read through to begin with.
I was elected to kick ass and chew bubble gum, not to read.
Plus, there's a good chance that kids may have already known this story thanks to watching the TV show or playing a different Dragon Ball game, so the game didn't need to get that into detail with things. Likewise, even though the turn-based combat of something like Pokemon isn't that complicated and can be mostly brute forced through if necessary, the fact that this game had real-time action in it made it a really appealing prospect for players in search of something a bit more stimulating. This all culminates in the game with a very positive feedback loop for younger players. It features an iconic cast of characters they're familiar with, going through a story that they're either already intimately knowledgeable about or at least takes place in a world that they're already emotionally invested in, and features satisfying and relatively fast-paced action too on top of it. And as if that weren't enough, a lot of this game's players were probably the type of kids who watched Dragon Ball Z whenever it was on Toonami, and that was basically just reminding them to play more of this game too in the process.
It's Dragon Ball Z, the Legacy of Goku II. This game is extremely entertaining. May cause like adventures of friends, pets, and all foods except maybe pizza.
This combination of familiar characters and good enough gameplay, along with the constant exposure of Dragon Ball Z on TV, is effectively a Trojan horse introduction to RPGs. Calling back to that bit I did on operant conditioning, it's rewarding the player with scenes from the anime for playing through the game, and in doing so, it's easing the player into the tropes and conventions of the genre through something they like until they realize that they might be interested in trying out other, potentially more complex JRPGs.
And like, not to be blunt about it, but I was also like 7 or 8 at the time and wasn't a fan of reading until I was like at least a couple of years older. So playing text-heavy, turn-based RPGs didn't appeal to me, but playing a game where I already kinda knew the story and it had action RPG gameplay was just a lot more interesting.
Even if you think this game is hardly comparable to Secret of Mana as being a gateway drug into the world of role-playing games, I still find this comparison apt in how parts of the Legacy of Goku II were seemingly influenced by it. While different in their implementation and relatively commonplace in the genre to begin with, several of the major changes to this game share roots with Square's iconic title, such as the ability to sprint, play as multiple characters, and the inclusion of a Mode 7 style world map. These changes offer such a huge quality of life improvement to the general game experience that it actually makes the world feel like a place you'd want to explore and spend time in, as opposed to an area that was just designed for 2 characters to brawl in. Not that there's anything wrong with just wanting a Dragon Ball Z game that's focused on combat, of course. I mean, there's a reason why the vast majority of DBZ games are fighters after all, but it's just amazing to have a game that circumvents that and tries to explore other sides of the series' appeal.
Because ultimately, an action RPG Dragon Ball game that allows you to go through one of the series' best stories in a relatively open world manner is, well, it's a home run of an idea, right? So, does Dragon Ball Z, The Legacy of Goku II, hold up? Well, yeah, in terms of its gameplay and presentation, it absolutely does hold up. And no, in the sense that it doesn't really represent Dragon Ball Z as we know it today.
The Legacy of Goku II is a massive improvement over the first game. In fact, it's so good a sequel that I genuinely consider it to be one of the best sequels of all time on the simple premise that it's just that much better than what came before it. It's got its flaws, but the Legacy of Goku II manages to retell the Trunks, Android, and Cell sagas with solid enough gameplay, strong enough visuals, and a darn good enough take on the series' Funimation score that it's hard not to recommend it to diehard Dragon Ball fans who have somehow missed out on it. And for those of you who aren't Dragon Ball fans but are still watching, it's hard not to recommend it to you either. While the game isn't explicitly impressive, it is a decent primer on the events of the story it covers and is also decently short. At the very least, it's much shorter than watching the original anime or even the Dragon Ball Z Kai version of the same story, so it's a fairly small investment for those of you curious to get into the franchise. Plus, the game also has its own charm in the use of its visuals and music that honestly isn't present in the original source material. While we may get another quote-unquote proper Dragon Ball Z action RPG someday, Dragon Ball Z's The Legacy of Goku series represents the show at the peak of the American zeitgeist. This is the Dragon Ball Z that got immortalized in movies like Boyhood, the version of the show that helped make Toonami the go-to after-school block of animation and helped popularize anime with a generation of kids. So while it doesn't necessarily capture what Dragon Ball Z is today, and as such doesn't hold up in a way, it's a fascinating time capsule into the American Dragon Ball Z of yesterday. It's something that could be played through and compared to the 1.5 million other flavors of the shows, such as the original Japanese dub, the Dragon Ball Z Kai version of the story, heck, even just other retellings of these stories in other Dragon Ball Z games. More so, it's representative of a version of the show that isn't particularly well preserved these days, as the only legal and convenient way to watch the Funimation dub and the way it was originally presented to us is to buy a 4x3 Blu-ray that doesn't actually do much to preserve the integrity of the original image thanks to some aggressive digital noise removal. Heck, even though the show is on streaming services, you can't even stream a 4x3 version of it, nor can you stream the original American soundtrack. And because of that, this game feels weirdly preservationist and important from a historical point of view.
Okay, I feel pretty good having gotten all of that off my chest, so without further ado, let's check up on that epic battle between good and evil again.
All right, great. So are we gonna fight or not? I thought you'd never ask. Wait, what? Gumby arms!
Wait, that was it? Are you kidding me? That was... Okay. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you haven't already, you remember to answer the question of the day over in the comments. If you want to support the channel and help it grow, you could do so by sharing this video with some folks that you think may enjoy it, as well as by subscribing to my Patreon or donating to my Buy Me a Coffee, where you can also get some bonus goodies. You could also follow me on Twitter and Instagram by looking up @NichePlays on those respective sites, or by following the links down in the description. And if you aren't sick of my voice yet, you could also check out my podcast, Media Obscura. It's hosted by myself, along with my girlfriend Sierra and my best friend Raekwon, and we talk about old and obscure retro movies and TV shows. You can check out the podcast on your favorite podcast player or on my alternate channel, which will be linked in the pinned comment and description. And yeah, if you do, I hope you enjoy it. If not, I get it. There are a lot of podcasts out there. So yeah, bye.